Last week, Chicago's Board of Education made an unprecedented move to shut down 50 of the city's public schools. The massive closures will affect 30,000 students, 90% of which are African American and Latino. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel pushed for the controversial measure, claiming that it was necessary to balance the city's deficit. But many are calling it an obvious push for privatization at a volatile time where education's already becoming more and more segregated. So here to talk about this and how it could be symptomatic of a much larger issue at hand, I'm joined now by Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts and author of the book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Richard, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
So do you think that the recent school closures in Chicago represent an example of class warfare?
Absolutely. I think that they are a sign that an economy that's in trouble is deciding that the best way to handle its difficulties is to reduce the opportunities and the services provided to poor people, to working class people, not to go after those with the wealth, not to go after those who have made the most money and increased their wealth over the last 30 years. It is a definite discriminatory way to cope with economic problems at the expense of those most vulnerable.
So as someone who's studied class issues for more than 40 years, I mean, explain to my audience right now, what does it even mean to say that we live in a class society?
It means that we have a division in our society, that after we finish with our patriotic statements about all being Americans, some of us are in a position to make an enormous amount of money, not out of the work we do, but out of the stocks and bonds we own, out of the businesses we control, out of the money manipulations we can make with our banker friends, and so on. Whereas the average American depends on his or her job, having a job, earning a decent income, having a certain number of benefits. And when the economy is going well, then everybody gets a piece. But when the economy is having trouble, of the sort we have had now for the last 6 years, since 2007, then it's kind of everybody for themselves. And those at the top are determined in a declining economic system to hold on or even to increase what they have. And that can only happen by taking away from the middle and the bottom. And that's what school closings and cutbacks in pensions and layoffs, that's what they mean.
One thing I find really interesting, Professor, is that crises are now created out of overabundance and not scarcity, unlike the past. I mean, you know, too many houses being built can cause the housing collapse, this bubble exploding. I mean, explain this new phenomenon that we're seeing, and is this just the new norm that we're going to just see continue?
Well, I think it's a feature of this kind of economic system. That's why I referred to capitalism in my speeches and in my writings. It is a system that did real well for us for a while, but it doesn't work anymore, at least not for the majority of people. It is not producing the goods. It's not delivering the goods. For most people, it's delivering the bads, whether it's your child who can't afford a college education without going into wild levels of debt, whether it's a job that looks more and more insecure with the passage of time, whether it's a medical program that doesn't give you the coverage you need and worries you with the debts and the bills you won't be able to pay. I mean, we're seeing a system that is breaking down, that is not working for folks, and it's hard to face that. Our politicians want us to believe it'll all go away. They've been telling us that for the last 5 years. It isn't happening. The future does not look good. The recovery is not affecting most Americans. They hear about it, they just don't experience it. This is a system that doesn't work, and whether it's a Chicago school closing or whether it's 100 other symptoms we see every day, the question is, when will the American people recognize that this isn't a problem of this or that rule or this or that law or this or that industry? This is a systemic problem. It's a system in which we all do what we have to do to get by, but the end result is not good for the majority of people.
You've said that it has continued to get worse, and you mentioned the 2007 crises. I mean, saw a recovery, but only for that top 1 to 5% and not for anyone else. Right. In fact, it was arguably the worst recovery in modern business cycle history. In the U.S., Why did we see the recovery only for the rich? And will this continue to get even more narrow until this inevitably collapses, Professor?
Yes, I think the so-called recovery is a result of how the government in this country, shaped and controlled as I believe it is by the biggest businesses, how they handled this crisis. They poured tons of money into the biggest banks. They bailed out the largest corporations. They, in turn, took this money and speculated in the stock market, as they always do, driving up the prices of stocks. But meanwhile, the wages of Americans keep shrinking. The benefits they count on keep being cut back. The government services they need are shrinking at a time when they need them greater. So for the mass of people, life is getting harder. They have less money to spend. That, in turn, doesn't support the economy. Look, here's the easiest way to understand the absurdity. We have 20 to 25 million Americans unemployed or underemployed. We have about a fifth of our tools, equipment, our capacity to produce sitting idle. We're an economy that can't put the tens of millions of people who want a job together with all the tools and equipment and raw materials they need to do a job. And if they did it, we would have an enormous amount of wealth with which to solve our problems and to take care of our needs and to help the rest of the world. But we live in an economy which can't put together the unemployed people, the unutilized resources to produce the wealth we all know we need and want. That's a sign of a system that isn't working, except for those at the top who get all the benefits of government programs. And as long as we let that happen, the inequality will get worse, as it has for 30 years. And the tensions that follow that, particularly in a country like ours, which prides itself on being middle class, the tensions of a split like that between rich and poor are promising us very serious social difficulties coming down the road and coming down soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating how the smartest minds are working on death and destruction, and we have this perpetual warfare economy. And I mean, you're talking about all these social services that are being cut. I mean, it pains me to hear people repeat these myths about the welfare queen and Social Security as if those are the programs that are really, we need to be worrying about siphoning money from the taxpayers. I mean, you just wrote a great article about Social Security and Truth Out. Obama and Congress recently agreed to reduce payouts to Social Security. Why is that such a bad idea and such a bad austerity measure to cut specifically?
Well, you know, put aside the sheer humanity of it. We have the top 1% of the country getting wildly richer for 30 years, and now we have a difficulty, and we're going to cut the payments we make to people over 65 after they've given us a lifetime of work. It is an astonishing thing to do. It's even more astonishing when I remind everyone that on January 1st of this year, the payroll tax that all Americans who earn wages and salaries pay was raised. That's the money that goes into Social Security to pay for it. So January 1, we asked people to put more in, and in March of this year, Obama and his advisors announced that having gotten us to put more in, he's going to cut what we pay out in benefits. But the absurdity gets even worse, because the money given to the older folks, that's money that's going to be spent by them, buying goods and services that provide jobs for Americans. If you cut what you give the old, they will have less to spend, and that will mean fewer jobs for Americans working to produce what those old people could have and should have been able to have to spend. So at a time of already unemployment, it is counterproductive. It is the kind of cutting of spending that makes an economic situation that is already bad even worse, on top of the sheer injustice of doing this to the people who deserve it least.
Right. And, you know, Dr. Wolff, what economic changes are needed to not only exit this ongoing global crisis, but to also prevent future crises? Because I think when people are looking at what you're saying, they say, capitalism in its pure form would work. It's become crony, it's become corrupted. What's your response and what's the solution?
I appreciate the idea of a pure capitalism, but usually whatever noun comes after the word pure is a fantasy. Nothing is pure. Life isn't pure. Nothing ever was pure. A pure capitalism is a pure fantasy. We have capitalism as we have always had it, with its warts and its problems and its blemishes. And we now have a capitalism which can't deliver the decent job which it once did, the decent income which it once did. And so it can't command the respect and it can't command the support that it once did, and that's happening around the world. And I think we have to face it. And the kinds of changes we need are not cosmetic, not another law, not another regulation. We have seen laws and regulations can be evaded, avoided, weakened, and eventually gotten rid of. That's what the people at the top do. That's why they control politics. That's why they buy the politicians. We have to make fundamental changes. And the one that I think is needed is to change the way we organize enterprises. If we believe in democracy, that it ought to apply to the businesses of this country. They should be run democratically by the majority of the people who work there and the majority of the people who are the customers. Together, they should make the decisions. If we want the economy to work for everybody, everybody has to be in charge. If we want the economy to work for the 1%, then leave it as it is, because they're the ones in charge.
Right. I mean, kind of at the cooperative level. I mean, what a concept, what a revolutionary concept to have actual democracy from the grassroots up. Amazing. Thank you so much. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at University of Massachusetts and author of Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Appreciate you breaking all that down.